All right, diving deep today into a really fascinating piece of research you shared with us. It's a paper looking at the thinking abilities of the latest large language models. We're talking specifically about models designed for reasoning, sometimes called large reasoning models, or LRMs.
That's right.
So our mission today is to really unpack the findings from this paper, look at related sources, and figure out what these models can actually do when faced with problems that get harder and harder, based just on the research.
Exactly. And there's been, incredible excitement around these models, LRMs, because they use these sophisticated methods like chain of thought.
Right. Thinking step by step.
Yeah, kind of thinking aloud, generating those intermediate steps, and even using self-reflection sometimes. But the big question this research tackles is, well, is it true reasoning? Is it generalizable? Or is it something else?
Okay, so before we jump into the puzzles they use, which sound cool, why this approach? How do we normally test LLMs, and what's wrong with that?
Well, the traditional way often involves standard benchmarks, right? Like math problems, coding challenges, that sort of thing. And those are useful, sure, but they have limitations. The paper points out a couple of big ones. First, data contamination.
Meaning the model might have seen the answers during training?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or problems very similar to them. So you don't know if it's reasoning or just remembering. The other thing is, these tests usually just check the final answer.
Right, just pass-fail.
Yeah. They don't really show you how the model got there. You miss the process.
So you're not really testing the reasoning itself, just the outcome, which could be memorization. Got it.
Precisely. So to get past that, these researchers use something different. Controllable puzzle environments.
Okay.
Think classic logic puzzles, but set up so you can tweak them precisely. They chose these for a few key reasons. One, you can control the complexity very systematically.
Like adding more disks in Tower of Hanoi.
Exactly. Just dial up the difficulty. This also helps reduce that contamination risk because really complex versions of these puzzles probably aren't floating around everywhere online. And, crucially, the puzzles demand reasoning based only on the rules you give them.
So no outside knowledge needed. Just follow the rules provided in the prompt.
Right. You're isolating that ability to follow rules and make a plan within a closed system. And their setup, this is important, let them validate every single step the model generated in its thinking trace.
Every step. Yeah.
Using simulators.
Yeah.
They show this clearly in Figure 1, the top part. They could check if each intermediate move the model thought about was actually valid according to the puzzle rules, not just the final answer.
That's thorough. Okay, so which puzzles did they use? Figure 3 lists them, right?
Yep, 4 types. Tower of Hanoi, moving the disks, checker jumping, swapping pieces on a line, river crossing, getting people across a river with rules, and blocks, world stacking blocks.
Classic AI problems.
Pretty much. And for each one, they could crank up the difficulty by just adding more pieces, disks, checkers, people, blocks. Give them that precise control.
Okay, so they have this controlled setup. They can see the thinking. What happened when they started making the puzzles harder? This is where the main results come in, comparing the LRMs that think versus standard LLMs without that explicit process.
Yeah, they looked at models like Claude 3.7 Sonnet, both thinking and not, DeepSeek o3 Mini, tested them pretty extensively, lots of samples, big token budgets like up to 64K.
And the big finding?
The core finding is what they call 3 distinct reasoning regimes, based on how complex the puzzle instance was. You can see this pattern laid out in Figure 1 bottom, and Figures 4 and 5 really show it too.
3 regimes. Okay, walk us through them.
So Regime 1, low complexity problems, easy stuff.
Yes.
And here, maybe surprisingly, the standard models, the ones not doing the explicit step-by-step thinking.
Yeah.
They often did just as well, or sometimes even slightly better, than the thinking LRMs. And they were way more efficient, used fewer tokens.
Huh. So for easy problems, the extra thinking is just overhead. Maybe gets in the way.
Seems like it. Or at least it's not necessary. You can see that on the left side of the charts in Figure 1 bottom and Figure 4 and 5.
Okay, that's counterintuitive right off the bat. What's Regime 2?
Regime 2 is medium complexity, and this is where the thinking models, the LRMs, really shone. They were significantly more accurate.
Okay, so the thinking pays off here.
It does.
Yeah.
But, as you'd expect, it costs more. They used a lot more tokens to generate those thought processes, those intermediate steps. That's clear in the middle chart of Figure 1 bottom, and again, Figures 4 and 5.
Right. So thinking helps, but only in that middle sweet spot. It comes at a cost.
Right.
What about Regime 3, high complexity?
Regime 3. This is maybe the most striking result. They found a complete performance collapse.
Complete collapse. For which model?
For both types, thinking and non-thinking. Beyond a certain point of complexity, accuracy just plummeted to 0.
0, even with huge token budgets.
Yep. Didn't matter how much compute budget they gave them. Now, the thinking models, they might have pushed that collapse point out a little bit further.
Delayed it slightly.
Yeah, maybe delayed it a bit.
Yeah.
But they still hit the same wall. Complete failure.
Wow. A hard limit then. Okay, that leads to another thing you flagged from the paper. It's something kind of weird about how the LRMs behave near that collapse point. What happens to their, reasoning effort? The thinking tokens they use?
Right. This is really interesting. They call it a scaling limit. You can see it in Figure 6, bottom, and Figure 13. Initially, as the problems get harder, the LRMs use more thinking tokens.
Makes sense. Harder problem, more thinking needed.
Exactly what you'd expect. But then as they get really close to that collapse point, the point where they fail completely, they actually start using fewer thinking tokens. They decrease their reasoning effort.
Wait, what? The problem is getting harder. They have the token budget, but they think less.
That's what the data shows. It's like they sort of give up trying to reason it through, even though they could theoretically generate more steps.
So they don't just fail to find the answer. Their actual internal process seems to break down or scale back right when it needs to wrap up.
Precisely. The paper suggests this points to a pretty fundamental limitation in how their thinking process actually scales with difficulty. It's not just about finding the solution. The process itself seems to hit a ceiling and then oddly retracts.
That's fascinating, and it really highlights the value of being able to look inside the thoughts, not just at the final answer. That setup with the puzzles let them do that, right? Analyze the intermediate steps.
Absolutely. Digging into those reasoning traces, the step-by-step outputs, was key. Figure 7a and 7b show what they found.
What did the traces look like?
Well, for the simple problems, Regime 1, the LRMs, often found the correct solution pretty early on in their thinking.
Okay, good.
But then, weirdly, they'd often keep going, exploring lots of incorrect options afterwards. The paper calls it overthinking.
Huh. So they solve it, then confuse themselves, wasting compute.
Kind of, yeah. Inefficient even when they get it right. Then for the moderate problems, Regime 2.
Where they did better.
Right. There, the correct solutions tended to show up later in the thought process. They had to explore some wrong paths first, sort of work through the errors before landing on the right sequence.
Okay, that seems more like how humans might problem solve sometimes.
Maybe. And then for the complex problems, Regime 3, near the collapse.
Let me guess, no correct solutions anywhere.
Exactly. The trace analysis confirmed it. The failure wasn't just a wrong final answer. They simply couldn't construct a valid path to the solution anywhere in their generated thoughts.
And this connects to their ability to self-correct, I suppose.
It does. The analysis suggests that while they can sometimes self-correct, especially on simpler steps, that ability is pretty limited and, well, inefficient. It clearly breaks down at higher complexities. It's not a robust mechanism for hard problems.
Okay, so the picture is getting clearer. Thinking helps in the middle, but it's fragile, inefficient sometimes, and hits a hard wall. Now, you mentioned the paper also found some results that were just puzzling. Things that really make you question what's going on with LRM reasoning. Section 4.4, right?
Yeah, these were some eyebrow raisers for sure. They challenged some basic assumptions.
Okay, lay the first puzzle on us.
All right, remember the Tower of Hanoi puzzle?
Yep, moving the disks.
So the researchers tried giving the model the explicit algorithm for solving it, like the literal step-by-step instructions.
Okay, so not just the rules, but the how-to guide.
Exactly. The optimal recursive solution spelled out right in the prompt. You'd think that would make it much easier, right? Just follow the instructions.
Absolutely. Should boost performance significantly, especially at higher complexities.
But it didn't. Performance didn't really improve much at all. And the collapse still happened around the same complexity level. Figures 8a and 8b show this.
Wait, giving it the answer key didn't help it solve harder versions? How is that even possible? That seems raw.
It's deeply counterintuitive. Finding the algorithm should be the hard part. Executing known steps should be easier. The fact that they still failed suggests the bottleneck isn't just about finding the solution path.
So what is it then?
Well, the paper suggests it points to limitations in exact computation. Problems with rigorously checking steps, consistently following logical procedures, maintaining accuracy over many steps even when the procedure is given.
Wow. So they struggle with the actual doing of logic step by step, not just figuring out what logic to do.
That seems to be the implication. They can generate text that looks like a logical plan, but executing it precisely and reliably, especially over many steps, is where they falter.
Okay, that's one big puzzle. What was the second one?
The second major puzzle was how differently the models performed across different types of puzzles, even when those puzzles seemed, comparable in difficulty or required a similar number of steps.
Different puzzles, different performance, even if they look similar on paper.
Massively different sometimes. This is shown in figures 8C, 8 pence, and also detailed across figures 10, 11, and 12. For example, they found Claude 3.7 Sonnet could handle Tower of Hanoi for N10 disks. That's over 1,000 optimal moves, and it could correctly execute about 100 moves before the first error. Pretty good.
Okay, 100 steps on a complex N10 Tower of Hanoi.
Right, but then take river crossing. For N3 pairs, it only requires 11 moves total to solve optimally. Much, much simpler than N10 Tower of Hanoi. Even simpler than N5 Tower of Hanoi, which needs 31 moves.
Okay.
On that Ender 3 river crossing, the same model failed after only about 4 correct moves.
Hold on. It can do 100 steps on a really complex Tower of Hanoi, but falls apart after 4 steps on a simple river crossing that only needs 11 steps total.
Exactly. That's the puzzle. Huge inconsistency. It could handle dozens of moves in one context, but barely string together a few correct moves in another, much simpler context, judged by total steps needed.
That completely undermines the idea of a general reasoning capability, doesn't it?
It certainly raises serious questions. Why such variation? The paper hints at possibilities. Maybe it's about limited generalization, or maybe it's back to training data. Perhaps the model saw lots of Tower of Hanoi examples, but fewer or different structures for river crossing, making it brittle when faced with that specific logic.
So it might be more about pattern matching specific structures seen in training than about applying general logical rules flexibly.
That's one strong possibility these results point towards. The reasoning isn't robustly transferable across different problem structures, even simple ones.
Okay, bringing this all together then. What does this mean for you, listening? Why should we care about these specific puzzles and performance collapses? How does this affect our understanding of AI in the real world?
I think it's fundamental, really. It tells us a lot about what these models actually are and what they aren't. This research makes it pretty clear. Current LRMs are not these universally capable, logical reasoning machines we might sometimes imagine them to be.
They're not just general problem solvers yet.
Not at all. Their performance is incredibly sensitive, not just to how complex a problem is, but maybe even more importantly, to the specific type of reasoning task it involves. That cross-puzzle inconsistency is huge.
And the thinking part, the chain of thought.
It definitely helps, especially in that middle complexity range, regime 2. But it doesn't magically overcome these deeper limitations. It doesn't fix the issues with precise, step-by-step execution, or the failure to generalize across different kinds of logical structures.
So you really can't just assume an LRM can reliably think through any complex problem you throw at it, even if it produces convincing step-by-step reasoning on simpler or maybe more familiar tasks. Its abilities seem more fragile and, well, specialized than the name large reasoning model might suggest.
Exactly. And just telling it how to solve the problem doesn't necessarily fix it, which points to something deeper going on than just finding the strategy.
So this deep dive really underscores that while these models, LRMs, are advancing and the thinking mechanisms are interesting, they're hitting some significant, perhaps fundamental roadblocks, especially when dealing with complexity or less familiar types of reasoning. They're not quite mini human brains, are they? There's something different.
Definitely different. And maybe to leave you with a final thought to chew on, given these findings that even provide the explicit algorithm doesn't prevent failure at higher complexities, and that performance is so wildly inconsistent between puzzles that might seem similar in terms of steps, what does that really tell us?
Yeah.
What's the gap between what these models are doing, maybe incredibly sophisticated pattern matching or recalling structures seen in training, and what we intuitively think of as true, robust, generalizable reasoning? The kind that can reliably tackle novel problems, consistently apply logic, regardless of the specific format. That seems like the core challenge still ahead.
A huge challenge indeed, something for all of us to keep thinking about as this technology develops. Thanks for walking us through this fascinating, sometimes really puzzling research. Keep exploring, keep questioning.